everyone. Welcome to the Gen Online Summit, Living Solutions for a Regenerative World. We're pleased to have with us today Dr. Marilyn Hamilton, a city evolutionist, futurist, PRAQtivist, author, and independent researcher. She is founder of Integral City Meshworks, author of Integral City book series, and curator of Urban Hub 20. Welcome, Marilyn. It's an honor to have you with us today.
And the honor is mine also. I'm delighted to meet you, Jennifer, again.
Wonderful. So, Marilyn, who is the human being with us in here today? Who are you?
That's a beautiful question. So I think I would say that I'm an activator of the human hive. I'm very interested in human systems. And throughout my career, I worked with individuals to help them develop. Then I worked with leaders. Then I worked with teams, then organizations, and then communities and sectors, and then finally the city. And each one of them I work with as a living system. So I see the city, for instance, it's not all the bricks and mortar, it's not the buildings, it's people. And so I am called to learn how people can live to their highest potential. And at the same time, I'm interested in how we connect to Gaia, to our Mother Earth, because I also think our planet is a living system. And so I'm looking how to make that handshake. And that's what makes my heart sing, to be of service to Gaia and to make people be their highest, best potential and serve their selves and each other in the world. That's who I am.
That sounds wonderful, Marilyn. Could you tell us more about the place where you are right now, the place where you live in?
Yes. Well, I'm originally Canadian. And so I grew up in Canada, all across Canada, and did a lot of traveling. My grandmother, though, was Scottish. And so I moved 3 years ago to Findhorn Ecovillage in Scotland. So I live in Findhorn, and I'm very familiar not only with the Ecovillage here, but also with Jen, because this is also where Jen has its headquarters. Yeah, so that's where I live.
So maybe for the people who does not know much about living in community or living in eco-villages, could you describe a little bit more how are your daily life around the eco-village?
Sure. Well, you know, right now we're still in the middle of the pandemic. So the life here day to day now is quite different than it was a year ago. So I can describe sort of bits of both of those. We have about 400 to 500 people who are residents of this eco-village. We live on a peninsula. So there is a fishing village that's right out close to the Moray Firth, and then there's smaller municipalities up the other end of the peninsula, and we're right in the center. We actually even live right beside a airbase. So the British military has some presence on this peninsula as well. But in general, it's like living, first of all, when it was started, it was like the dunes. It was like a desert. And now, after 58 years, we have a beautiful village with very mature trees. We have very interesting residents, little neighborhoods. Each of them have different personalities. So we have buildings that were made out of the natural timber from local. We have the street I live in is called Field of Dreams. They look like very big houses, but in fact, they're mostly all eco houses with bed and breakfast so that people can come and stay here while they take courses. And then one of the most famous neighborhoods we have is made out of whiskey barrels, and they're called barrel houses. They're huge 2-story whiskey barrels, and they've been repurposed. into very cozy, beautiful little houses, and they have their own little neighborhood. So we have some other neighborhoods that are more modern eco houses, and we have co-housing. So there's a whole group called East Winds, where families are mostly able to keep their kids there, and they share facilities like the laundry facilities and the public areas. So those different kinds of neighborhoods, when we were able to interact, also connected to the Findhorn Foundation. The Findhorn Foundation was the original organization who started here. And they started by offering spiritual center and learning facilities. And then they kind of grew a little bit into the Ecovillage idea. And then gradually they woke up one day and found they were all three things: a spiritual center, a learning community, and also an ecovillage. So we have these pockets of different ways that people are both able to live day to day and also to make their living and be a community. There's one place very important, and that's the community center. And during the pandemic, we've all been very sad because we've had to close it. And it was one of the places that we would come and eat together. And I think in most eco villages, eating together, preparing food and eating together is really what makes the heart of the community connect regularly every day. Yeah, so we're starting to open it up a little bit, as we're also starting to open up our sanctuaries. So we have several different sanctuaries here. One of them is very famous. It's called a nature sanctuary, and it looks like a little hobbit house. And we have roofs. We have natural roofs, and on the roof of it's made out of beautiful stone, and it's like a kiva, circular, and it grows daffodils and flowers on the roof. So it's always a beautiful, fun place to go. And we sing Teze there. So Teze, the sacred songs that were started in France, and every morning we would go and sing there. And during the pandemic, we've had to change it to be online. But last year, my day would start. I would get up and I would go sing Teze. Then I would go to the sanctuary for meditation. Then I would come home for my breakfast and work. And then I would go to the CC, the community center, for lunch. And then I would do some community work and often go back for my dinner at the CC. And then we would have all kinds of activities at night. So that's what it was like a year ago.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much for that beautiful picture and such an amazing description of your life in the Ecovillage, and also the place in which you are right now. It makes me think of also the diversity that we find in villages, small villages, and even in small cities. And I wonder, how do you connect the way in which you have chosen to live, the place where you are living right now, with the work you do with Integral City Meshworks? I would love to hear more about that connection, and also about a little bit of your path until you decided to found this organization.
Okay. Well, one of the things I haven't mentioned yet about the Ecovillage that's very important here is how we grow things. I mentioned the trees. We have very mature trees and beautiful gardens, but we also are very practical and are growing vegetables and food for the community. So we have a whole very large Kalaran garden, and we also have the original garden where the founders originally located their caravan and grew their vegetables. And then we have near the barrel houses that I was talking to you, there's also somebody who has a great permaculture garden. Craig Gibson is actually world famous for permaculture, and he's won awards and recognition here in Scotland. And the reason I mentioned this is because I think my experience here in the Ecovillage is really connected to nature. So one of the reasons it's been tolerable to exist during the pandemic is because when we go out and do our daily exercise that we're allowed to during lockdown, we can walk straight out into nature. We see our gardens, then we walk out to the dunes, and right now it's just going to be the beginning of April at the end of this week, and all the gorse is turning into yellow. Pretty soon it'll be like waves of yellow on the dunes, just seeing that. And then I can just walk 10 minutes to the sea. I passed one of my friends on her bicycle over there today. And what was she doing? She was going for a swim in the North Sea. Because even though it is this far north, we're at the 59th parallel, we can connect with nature in so many ways. Walking, bicycling, going to the sea, going to the Findhorn River. And when I think about my work in much larger cities, I feel that that's one thing that has been lost in our cities, except where they have focused on becoming a green city. Most people don't have a really strong connection with nature, and the cities have disconnected from their ecoregions. So I feel it's really important to learn these lessons, and it's one of the reasons I brought my work here to Findhorn. So Integral City has teaching and training courses, and we've been running them here when we were able to in person. Now we do them online. But when we're able to get people to actually come here, they can have experiments of what they might do when they go back to the city. So they can see how water is clean through our living machine. So it's actually coming from these very large eco houses and then going down through reed beds and coming out very clean at the other end. And it can be recycled and reused. We're growing as much of our own food as possible. And we know very much every day what the weather is like and how that impacts not just what are we going to wear, but how is it going to actually cause our gardens to grow or not. And here we have, both drought and too much rain, one or the other. And I think, again, because we have in many ways more than one geography, more than one climate to experiment with here, when people come to visit, they can say, oh, I could do that back home. I could create a neighborhood garden because I know in my city there will be a brown field or somebody's front yard that's not being used for anything. Why don't we create a community garden? And I feel that the Ecovillage gives us lessons in community, gives us lessons in growing, keeps us reconnected to nature. And I think as the world comes out of the pandemic lockdown conditions now, we can take many of those lessons and not go back to the way we were in cities, but to still be able to say hello to our neighbors who all of a sudden in cities have become very close to us, like we all are in the Ecovillage, because we were kept together during the pandemic. And now we really shouldn't lose all those added extra energies that I feel are needed in order for cities to become not only reconnected with their ecoregion, but actually in relationship to the whole planet, not just being resource users, but actually resource generators. Yeah, so that's some of my ideas, Jennifer.
Thank you, Marilyn, for that picture. Yeah, probably many of the people who are listening to this webinar right now are people who live in cities. And for me, at some point, and for many of my friends, one of the key questions keeps being, we are about to take on the quest of living more into the rural way of living. We know that we don't want to keep on sustaining the type of style of living that we have been having. We can recognize that it's not sustainable, that we need to work towards regeneration. We need to take responsibility of our action and our impact in the world. We as the human species. And if we want to earn the right to keep on living in this planet, we want to allow regeneration between the relationship with ourselves and the relationship with our neighbors, but also with the relationship with Mother Earth. And in that quest, there are different roles that I personally have been experiencing and exploring, and that transition from a more urban life to a more rural life takes me to ask many questions regarding to my own capacity to live in a different way, the validity or the legitimacy to think that now I need to move from the city to the rural area to live better, or how do I transform the place where I live in the city? No, and
Yes.
so I found myself. I found the explanation you have, or the Ubiquity University propose, or maybe is the whole package of Integral City, and there is these different voices. The voices of the citizens, the voices of civic managers, business people, and innovators, and the third sector. And I would love if you could explain more or help us to explore more in those different voices. And while people want to transition to a more regenerative style of living, what's the invitation that we can attend while we do that transition?
Those are great questions. Thank you for having discovered what I call the 4 voices of the city. I learned those 4 voices from biomimicry. I learned them from the honeybee. So another way that I call a city that is in balance with nature would be the human hive. So I learned that bees are the most intelligent species of the invertebrates. They've been around for 100 million years, and they are able to communicate. They are able to sustain their hives by producing 20 kilograms of honey a year. And they use the equivalent of those 4 roles in the hive. The people we call citizens, they would be their main foragers. So they would go off and get the nectar and the pollen. And they bring this back to the hive. And you know, honeybees have a way of communicating. They dance. They have a little dance, a waggle dance at the front of the hive. And so they tell all the other bees, there's a lot of really good blue flowers over there, and there's all kinds of nectar and pollen that we can bring back, and it's this far away, and the sun's at this angle. So they actually are able to communicate very clearly. But there are also another group in the hives that we would call diversity generators. And those are the ones I call the innovators, or the businesses in the community. And the innovators are going off, the diversity generators, and they're going to different flower patch. This one maybe has yellow flowers, and it's in a very different direction. And the reason that this is important for the bees is because they have 2 other roles in the hive. They have resource allocators, and that would be like our civic managers. So the resource allocators work with what we call in the city, the third sector, and in the beehive, they would be called the integrators or the inner judges. And together, the resource allocators and the inner judges say, we're getting to our goal. We are managing to produce 20 kilograms of honey this year. And we can do that as long as the conformity enforcers or the foragers keep bringing back the amount of raw material that we need. If they do not bring back 100%, those resource allocators say, well, we'll just won't top your bee fuel up that much. So they actually have a way of rewarding performance. And gradually, when the bees keep going to the same location for the pollen and the nectar, it gets less and less and less and less. And finally, when they come back to the hive, the resource allocators say, no, we're not going to give you any extra fuel. We cut you off no reward. And the bees get very depressed. And they can actually measure depression in bees through their pheromones. However, there's another group of bees, those diversity generators, that keep coming back. They haven't worn out their patch of flowers because they're going to something completely different. And they're having their little dance and they're having their little party. And eventually the foragers notice, oh, maybe if we followed that information, we could get our reward again. So they do take the information, they discover, oh yes, there's a whole new patch of renewable energy, and they come back and the hive is able to work. It's kind of like a complexity cycle that they have. That's how they sustain themselves internally in the hive. But what always fascinated me was they also pollinate their ecoregion. Well, they're doing that. So they're actually creating renewable energy for next year, not just this year, but next year. And that means they have a double sustainability loop. And I've always thought, what is the equivalent that humans can do? So we've learned a great deal about what we need to sustain ourselves and who are we? We're not bees. Our job isn't to produce honey and pollinate. I heard James Lovelock say that humans are Gaia's reflective organs. And I thought, wow, that's amazing, because James Lovelock was the person who created the idea that Gaia, our planet, is a living system. And so it has now become much more accepted than 40 years ago when he made that proposal. And I think if Gaia is a living system and humans are Gaia's reflective organs, then maybe cities are the organs. Maybe our organizations are organelles. Maybe us as individuals are like cells in those organs. So I feel like if that might be the case, then every city does have a purpose. Most of our cities haven't figured out what that purpose is. But if we did have a purpose, then we could work together like the bees do in order to sustain that and be of service way beyond just humans, but the rest of life on the planet as well. So that's what I aspire to. I have very large aspirations for cities and for humans, because I think Gaia has evolved us in service. And that if we fail to ask the question, how can we be of service, then we're not living into our full evolutionary potential. So I call the cities the human hives, and those four roles that you talked about, or voices as I call them, the citizens, the business innovators, the civic managers, and the third sector or the civil society, those are our equivalent in our living system. And I think when we're trying to figure out what is the best thing that we can do, we need all four voices at the table. We need all of those four voices. One of the interesting things about being in an eco-village is those four voices are here. We're much closer to them. We're tending to live with them day by day, and we can become more intentional about how we do our work and make our decisions. And then again, I think we can model what needs to happen in the neighborhoods of cities, as well as the whole city. So that gives you a little bit of a picture of what I'm trying to link with Integral City and eco-villages.
So this is a beautiful explanation. I love the way you managed to make the image of the hive and the different roles among the bees, and wondering what's that link between the pollen and the honey and the source of renewable energy? What would be the analogy for the human hive? So I would like to explore more about the aspirations for the cities, like the cities as organisms that actually do have a purpose. I happen to have in my hands a book from Jaime Izquierdo Vallina. I don't know if you know him, from Spain. He had something called the Agropolitan City, the Cosmopolitan Village. That's his book. And he proposes different roles for the city in relationship with the rural area and the different and the needed evolution of the villages and the towns in relationship to being the managers of the eco diversity and not only production of food. And even though the book has a very European comprehension of those relationships, there are things out of it that can be taken definitely for all the relationships between cities and towns around the world. So I would like to hear from you more about this idea of the cities as something that do have a purpose. Like, what do you think the purpose of the cities are, or how can a city discover or create its own purpose? How can that happen?
Those are all really good questions. And I think that many of the cities have grown into purposes that have emerged from our more recent history. For instance, that when we look at very large cities like London and New York, they kind of claimed their purpose and lived into it. London says its purpose is being the grand financier of the world, and New York is trade. But there are not a lot of other cities that can actually say in one word what is their purpose. So I think we're still in the process of discovering that. However, when I work with smaller places, it is much easier for them to discover what they feel called to be together for in purpose. I actually have something called the Master Code of Care, caring for self so we can care for others. So together we care for our places, and all together we care for the planet. And I think by examining and exploring and co-creating these ways of caring for one another, we discover what our purpose for the city will be. I've actually worked with one city in the United States, a small city, who came to the conclusion that its vision, its purpose for itself was care. It was able to demonstrate how that everyone would be able to learn, that their community was well connected and they had thriving economy. And right in the center of their diagram, they drew the heart of care, because they felt that the way that they could do that was by discovering and rediscovering and living out how to care for one another. The word care is very interesting. These days I'm working with Nottingham in the United Kingdom, who is working with moments of mass mindfulness. And so they're actually looking at how they care for one another through heart-centered coherence. And they feel that this is also something that they're able to offer to this area of the world. But if you think about the human body, the biophysical manifestation of who we are, each one of our organs has a purpose. And I think we're a fractal of the living systems that are larger than us, including Gaia. So I would say that I imagine that cities and their ecoregions probably have the similar kinds of purposes that our own organs perform for our body. And we would therefore honor them much more if we would care for them that way, realizing that they would be in service to their ecoregions and to the planet itself. So I think this is what we have the opportunity to discover in our next, maybe even we have to do it as fast as 10 years, because in the whole discussion about regenerativity these days, you probably have come across donut economics. And donut economics is a way of thinking about the flow of resources through the economy. And they're discovering that instead of looking at whole nations, probably the system that is most receptive to this are cities. because in cities you can see the economic flow that at this point in time has often been globalized and therefore not sustainable. But now this last year through the pandemic, we've had to come back and realize, okay, this is how the energy and food and resources we need to come into the city need to flow through the city, need to flow through the organs of the city, the organizations. But at the same time, what donut economics has recognized is that the earth itself has limitations. So there are whole scientific research, particularly made famous by a Swedish researcher, Rockström, and his whole team that has identified 9 different resources that the earth is in danger of not being sustainable for. And it is measurable, the degree to which we have been out of balance. In the same way, a donut has an inside, and the way of looking at the economic balance of those resources is the SDGs. So to look at the Sustainable Development Goals that came out of the UN, and we can see if we use them to stand for social justice, and we work in our cities to balance social justice and how we can live sustainably within our resources, that is going to be able to tell us what we're going to have to adjust in our cities in order to be in balance, in order to regenerate. And so we have some homework to do.
Yeah, definitely. We do have a lot of homework to do. Maybe to go through the end of our conversation and connect it with the homework that we have to do, I would like you to tell us more about Ubiquity University and what good invitations you may have out of the different courses and programs of the university.
Oh, thank you for that invitation. Well, I'm working with several different courses at Ubiquity University, and Ubiquity has really beautifully framed the way that it delivers its courses so that it's Gaia focused. They're all holistically designed and they're action oriented. And I love that we go from the big down to let's take some action. So I have 2 courses on the city there. So I do Beyond Smart, which just really teaches the 3 big frameworks that I use. One is the human hive. The second is meshworking. How do we do all this kind of weaving that we need to bring our resources together? And the other is the Integral City holistic model, which is also very similar to what Jen uses when you use your cards to do your analysis in the ecovillages. Yeah. And then my next course is called Beyond Resilient. And so it has a course that allows people to explore the 5 different maps that I use to be able to shapeshift the city. So I can use those 4 quadrants to look at the city like you use with Jen, or I can make them a holarchy of different relationships in the city, or I can show how the micro, macro, meso connections work, just like an ecology, and also all the different organizational shapes, and finally the spirituality of the city. So I teach all of those, and I also bring in a case study. So an eco-village is a very beautiful way to bring in a case study. And when I have been able to teach this live at Findhorn, I always use some example around here. So we worked on housing design. We worked on how do we bring the renewal of the eco-village to be able to change as the world is changing. But now we have at Ubiquity an even larger opportunity because we've created the Master of Regenerative Action. So Integral City is working with a whole group who are a lot of them are out of Costa Rica and Colombia, who have been looking at ecoregions. So Ed Muller from the International University of Cooperation has brought together a whole group who have great skills in looking at bioregions. And so they invited me as the person looking at the city as a living system to work with them. And we are creating courses that have the opportunity for especially young people to come together and regenerate a project in either an ecoregion or a bioregion. And I want to bring them together in the cities. So one of the action-oriented projects they might initiate for a city project is, how can we bring our awareness of our bioregions back into the city? And how can the city connect with its bioregion so that it can become both sustainable within itself in this balance of social justice along with the resources that we use? And also, how can we go back to my idea of the human hive, and that we are actually, as a city, regenerate our bioregion, regenerate our ecoregion. So together we create a renewable cycle, just like the bees have. And so I think that that is really what I think in the next 10 years, cities are being called to do. I said the last 10 years, I used this idea to wake up the human hive. The next 10 years, I want to grow up the human hive so that it takes responsibility for the human life that is really going to continue to live in cities, but I think we will reinvent them.
Exciting next 10 years, I think.
Yes.
Definitely. Yes. So with this invitation to think of the renewable cycles, and to think of cities as living systems, and to think of ecoregions, I want to really thank you for your presence, for your time today here with us in the online summit. And probably I would like to ask you for a message, something that can come from your heart and from your being for the youth, the young people today, being the activists, fighting or finding the ways to tell to the whole humanity, hey, wake up, we need to regenerate our world. What could be that message to them?
So I would say, dear youth, there is such a thing as a karma yoga in this work. And the karma yoga is something you can do every day. When you wake up and you're called to do what makes your heart sing, ask yourself first, how will I care for myself so that I can care for others? And together we can care for our place, and all together we care for Gaia. And at the end of your day, of hopefully doing what makes your heart sing, can you ask yourself, how did my day go? How did I care for myself? How did I care for others? How together did we care for our place? And together we cared for our planet. That is what I would say to youth. You are Gaia's reflective organ, and she asks you for that karma yoga.
Thank you, Marilyn. Thank you so much. It's been an honor to have you here with us today.
And a delight. Thank you so much, Jennifer. Thank you, and best wishes for the summit.